Yeah, it looks like you are. Setting up. Little bars moving. Read. Oh, here we go. Do not need my echo. It's very disorientating. And it still thinks that it's private for some reason. So we'll have to change that. The whole point of this is that it should be shared. All right, public. And we're good. All right, only a minute or so. That's not too bad for the way it goes sometimes. We had a few buttons I had to push extra because of the wonderful streaming system's irregularities. Good afternoon to everyone. Let's make this an official beginning to the book of Shemot and the beginning to 2024. As a little aside, people have often asked me whether or not, as Jews, we are allowed to celebrate the Gregorian New Year. That is to say, the changing of the calendar from 2023 to 2024, and whether we can wish people Happy New Year's or things like that. The answer that I have seen in every community is categorically yes. This is not a religious holiday of any way, shape, or form. It is a secular holiday, much like July 4th or other such a President's Day coming up in February, Martin Luther King Day in this month. These are days that are of civic importance and celebration, and as such, there is no conflict with any underlying Jewish issues. Moreover, in fact, I'm always a big fan of New Year's. Judaism has many New Years, as we've talked about in other classes. And throwing in one additional reminder that there's always a chance for beginning and new opportunities, I think is very much in keeping with the feel of Judaism. And so it's a very complementary civic holiday. So I hope everybody had a wonderful New Year. I hope you are looking forward to whatever can be new from this point forward. And I hope you are looking forward to the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. We have finished Bereshit yet again. We do it every year. And now we are diving into the book of Exodus. We are moving from the family situation of the children of Abraham into the national situation as the children of Israel. And of course, the most famous element of that is that we are now slaves in Egypt. What began as a refugee situation where we went down to Egypt with both permission as well as support from one of our own members. Joseph, I guess, could be called the anchor baby if people wanted to use that, the anchor relative. And then he brought the rest of his family, 70 total and strong. And unfortunately, the locals decided they didn't like these foreigners. And rather than simply expelling us, they decided to enslave us to benefit off our labor without having to pay. Obviously, enslavement is one of the most terrible evils throughout human history. And this is one of the places where we see that God indeed is opposed to this form of permanent enslavement of people. And obviously, the other part that goes along with the beginning of the book of Shemot is the introduction of the new main character, which is Moses. Moses is a fascinating figure, and he is rightly considered to be the second main character of the entire Torah, the first main character, of course, being God. And Moses's life is filled with just amazing different incidents. Not amazing that they would necessarily be the first choice for the script writers in Hollywood, but amazing because they are, in such few words, nevertheless packed with insights into both human nature as well as the nature of spirit in the world, and of course, this pinnacle of relationship with God. We are going to look at one such incident, perhaps the most famous incident, and one that is not delved into enough, in my humble opinion. And that is the incident of the burning bush, as it is usually colloquially called. This burning bush is going to pop up in chapter 3, and we're only going to look at about the first 10 verses of this chapter. But I think you'll agree that it is a profound section. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with our Hebrew text and let it speak for itself first before we demand more of it by probing its depths. Now Moshe was shepherding the flock of Yitro, his father-in-law, priest of Midian. He led the flock behind the wilderness and came to the mountain of God, the Horeb. So, just a little story update. Remember that Moshe had been born in Egypt of a slaved family, Amram and Yocheved. He had been taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, but when he went out among the slaves, he protected one of them to the point of killing the Egyptian. At that point, once he realized it was maybe public knowledge, he decided he needed to flee or else face murder prosecution. He ends up in the household of Yitro, who is, as we see here, a Kohen Midian. He is a priest of Midian, and he marries his daughter Tzipporah. And now he is just doing life. This is his sort of middle life period, the period between when he is 40 and 80, where he is just taking care of the sheep, doing the job that would be normal. Now, being a shepherd, as I've mentioned before, but I never know how many people have seen how many of my videos, being a shepherd was not an inconsequential job in the ancient world. I know we talk about the boy who cried wolf as being like a child's job to be a shepherd. That wasn't the point of that story. And also the fact that it was a child there that needed help was kind of the underlying assumption. Being an actual shepherd that could take an entire flock and head out here miles away from Midian into the wilderness of Sinai, as it will later be known more clearly, that is a terribly difficult job, and one that a person had to be very strong to be able to deal with. So despite Moses's age, this idea of him being a shepherd here is a symbol of his strength. It is a symbol of his character and should not be glossed over through the lens of medieval and Renaissance depictions of innocent waif-like shepherds. So he is there, and he is in this wilderness. We will later identify this wilderness as the Sinai Peninsula, remembering that Midbar in biblical Hebrew doesn't just mean desert in the geological sand dune kind of way. Midbar means the uninhabited region. It is an area where there is no human occupation. And he is well into this place. Indeed, the phrase that's used here is Achar Hamidbar. He is like behind the wilderness, which means he is way away from other human inhabitation. And he comes to the mountain of God, which we'll have to come back and discuss that moniker in a minute, which is known as Horeb. Okay. And Adonai's messenger was seen by him as the flame of a fire out of the midst of a bush. One of the reasons why I love Fox's translation is because it more clearly captures both the poetry of the Hebrew as well as some of its unusual constructed forms. Obviously, in English, we would not normally say, and Adonai's messenger was seen by him as the flame. It would be something along the lines of, and he saw Adonai's messenger in the flame, or something like that. But by having this very clear passive voice that it was seen by him and that it was seen as or in the flame or out of the flame, out of the midst of the bush, we get a layered experience to what was actually being seen by Moses. And it is slightly confusing, which is exactly the point. This experience of Moses is confusing. It was confusing to him. That's why he turns aside. And it is confusing to us. That's why theologically it is so important. So what did he see? He saw, right? Wow, hine, right? It's behold. Now here the bush is burning with fire, but the bush is not consumed. Again, one of the most famous phrases, and one that allows for multiple layers of interpretation, that the bush is burning, and it is burning with a fire, and the bush is not consumed. There is this building pattern of the surprise in the construction of the sentence. And we get Moses's response. Moshe said, "Now let me turn aside that I may see this great sight. For what reason does the bush not burn up?" Right, so he is perplexed by this sight. And the most important thing at the moment is the fact that this bush is not disintegrating through the fire. Uh, Seeing a bush on fire in the wilderness is moderately unusual, but certainly not unprecedented. Seeing a bush on fire that doesn't get burned up by the fire, that continues to burn, well, that is something that deserves greater attention and investigation. Verse 4, we see now that this is a response, or that there is a response to this action by Moses. Adonai saw that he turned aside to see. So God called to him out of the midst of the bush. He said, Moshe, Moshe. He said, here I am. Those who were studying with me just a little while ago may know that we went over this whole doubling of a name as a sign of affection, and also of the phrase hineni, of here I am, as a statement of zeal and preparedness. Moses indeed responds very powerfully to this call by God. He does not shrink, at least not at first, and seems to be able and ready to receive this communication. And God continues that communication now in detail. He said, do not come near to here. Put off your sandal from your foot, for the place on which you stand, it is holy ground. And he said, this is still God speaking, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzchak, the God of Yaakov. Moshe concealed his face, for he was afraid to gaze upon God. So we get introductions done here. And you may notice that the introduction begins with the connection to his father, which was Amram, as I mentioned earlier again, but it also contains a very familiar phrase. In the Amidah, in the Avot, the first blessing of the Amidah, this phrase, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Velohei Yaakov, is how we introduce God after we remind ourselves that God is our God, and that God is the God of our fathers in general. And now we get to the specific list here. So that part of the Amidah is very consciously mimicking this encounter with God at the burning bush. And something to bear in mind whenever you are standing for that prayer, to realize that its literary construction was done very deliberately so that we too could re-experience this moment of standing before the burning bush. And Moses is obviously overwhelmed, and he is afraid to look upon God. But God continues. Now Adonai said, I have seen, yes, I have seen the affliction of my people that is in Egypt. Their cry I have heard in the face of their slave drivers. Indeed, I have known their sufferings. God very powerfully expresses the empathy, the compassion, the sympathy for what's going on in Egypt, and reminds them that he is well aware, he is involved. Now, this phrase, yadati, the phrase of yodea, to know, is found throughout the book of Exodus, especially in the stories here in the first few chapters of knowing God or not knowing of God, of knowing suffering. And it's just a very tight literary device that is used throughout. But let's get to the meat of the matter. So I have come down to rescue it from the hand of Egypt, to bring it up from that land, to a land goodly and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite, to the Amorite and the Perizzite, to the Hivite and the Yebusite. So we've done other classes about the map and border and the different nations, but right now let's just look at this as the summary it is intended, that God is not trapped in the land of Canaan by coming here in the middle of the Midbar, in the middle of no man's land. It's partly proving that God is the God beyond the borders of any particular territory. And God is thus still powerful enough to reach into Egypt and pull the nation out, and to bring them back to that land that was first promised to Abraham, and to make good on that promise as well. And we finish up this incredible statement. So now, here, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. So now go, for I send you to Pharaoh. Bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So God is not merely encountering Moses as a, hi, how you doing? This encounter is very specific to the task, which is to bring out the people of Egypt, the people of Israel from Egypt. That God has recognized not only their plaintive cry, but that indeed they are being cruelly oppressed, and as such, this needs to stop. And Moses is going to be the instrument of that stop. That Moses is going to be the tool that God wields in order to bring the people out of Egypt. Now, there's so much more we could say about this section, and obviously much more to read, but I want to come back to this question, burning question, if you'll pardon the expression, that was introduced at the beginning, which is why? Why is this being given to Moses? Why is this happening at this place? Why is this happening in this way? It is confusing. Now, we, of course, the informed reader, we have read the Torah many times. We have heard about Moses in many different forms. For us, it's obvious. I mean, Moses is the guy. But in context, I always ask you to look at the text as it is being laid out as though it were for the first time. And you have to ask yourself, what has Moses done to earn this attention? What has Moses done here to earn this audience with God? And why do it through this whole symbolism of a burning bush in the middle of the wilderness on this mountain of Horeb? Couldn't this have been done in a dream back in the tent in Midian? Couldn't this have been done with anyone? What's going on here? And with those questions in mind, we're going to turn to our commentary. But before we do, I want to leave a little room if there are other questions that people have before we get into our set piece. Double check our chat on YouTube. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how we can understand this through some of the different ideas of our commentators. So the first thing we have to answer is, why is this called the mountain of God? Does that mean that Moses knew this was the mountain of God? Was he going to the mountain of God because he was hoping for an encounter with God? Well, says Rashi, no. It's named because of what happens there in the future. That this title is a narrative insert. It is not meant to be contemporary knowledge to Moses or to anyone else. It is not as though there was a large pin on the map that said Mountain of God that all the locals were aware of. This is a mountain that will become famous for what comes later, not that was already famous when Moses was coming by. Indeed, even Ezra confirms this by arguing this is the manner in which Moses recorded it. He points out from the meta perspective that, remember, Moses wrote down the Torah, and when Moses was recounting the events here that are found in chapter 3, Moses added in the phrase, the mountain of God, as a reference so that the people who would be hearing the Torah at that time would understand that the place they were at, Mount Sinai, is indeed the place where the burning bush incident occurred. So this is an interpolation, if you will. It is an anachronistic title. It is not something that was present chronologically at the time that Moses first went there, but it is a useful marker for those that are reading the Torah at other times. Very important to remember that the Torah was written. It is not a court reporter that is writing things down purely sequentially as they happened at the moment they happened. It is always being structured in a way that makes the most sense and the most meaning for those that would actually use the Torah when necessary. So it was not called the mountain of God at the time. It was just a mountain. Now the place is called Horeb because of its great heat and lack of rainfall. There is no moisture there, and the dryness is overpowering because the Nile is far away. So we can begin to unpack this question of why there, why not in Midian, why not somewhere else? And the first thing we want to do is try and understand, well, why is it called Horeb? I mean, what is Horeb about it? Well, it is because this is the root for no moisture. So this is a very dry area of the world, still to this day. And this is a place where there was no habitation, no people living there for precisely that reason. As even Ezra points out, the Nile is very far away, back in Egypt proper. And there are other water sources further to the east and northeast, into the land of Israel, of course. But here, this is about one of the least hospitable places you can find, and the name itself is telling you that. Excuse me. I know that today many people like to live in desert communities. I grew up in San Diego, where the desert communities were thriving, at least at the time. And certainly Phoenix and other parts of Arizona have exploded in population, as has places like Las Vegas. That's very much a modern phenomenon. It's usually very hard to find people willing to live in those types of areas without something else going on. Air conditioning or other reasons. Obviously, there are sometimes trade reasons in antiquity too. Now, where exactly are we? Well, we know that this place, this Horeb, is about 3 days' march from Egypt, as we know from Exodus 5:3, where Moses asked permission for his people to offer sacrifices there to Hashem. When he tells Pharaoh, hey, let my people go and have this offering, they ask that they can go 3 days away. So this is the mountain. Therefore, it is a 3-day march away. Now, the reason why the mountain is better known as Sinai is because this is where the miracle of the burning bush occurred. Now, as you can see from the transliteration here, the word for bush is Sneh. And Sneh and Sinai are very, very similar in their assonance and the style of their pronunciation. And thus, Sinai becomes the place of the Sneh. And that's why it is better known now as Sinai, even though it was first mentioned as Horeb here in chapter 3. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so we've got our place. This little mountain called Horeb. It's in a dry, no man's land, and there's a bush burning on it, and it's going to be called the Bush Mountain later on, i.e. Sinai. But what about Moses himself? Right, we've got the place, but we need the man. And Moses was a shepherd, and he led the sheep. Well, the Torah means, argues Or HaChaim, that God had his hand in this. He caused the sheep to move in that direction. Alternatively, he does posit, it means that Moses was in the habit of guiding his flocks as usual, but the sheep walked to that mountain on that occasion, for God wanted to speak to him there. So Or HaChaim is wrestling with an underlying question of human agency. That is to say, what would have happened if Moses had not wandered to the mountain? What would have happened if he had shepherded the opposite direction? Could he have shepherded the opposite direction? Was there a reason why he was there? Excuse me. Or do we say it was just dumb luck? Well, Or HaChaim is not a big fan of dumb luck as an explanation. And his argument is that this shepherding and his leading of the sheep, that this repetitiveness is implying that there was something leading the sheep. Indeed, he is sort of taking the liberty, or at least arguing that it could be read, that the he that is leading the sheep here isn't Moses, but in fact is God. That it is God as the second pronoun, the he there, that is bringing the sheep to this place, that this was a miraculous guidance of the animals in order to draw Moses closer. Now, not every commentator agrees with that. As we're going to see, most of the other commentators come up with reasons why Moses himself would have chosen to be in that area. And I think that is an important distinction for us to consider. Excuse me. I am just getting over a cold, and every now and then it is still going to give me a little bit of a coughing fit. All right, so he arrived at this mountain of God. Now, Al-Sheikh is going to argue that this phrase, mountain of God, is, yes, perhaps a later term that was applied, but it is also indicative of what Moses was seeking. Because, Al-Sheikh argues, of his secluded prayer in that place, it merited to become the mountain of God. Moses traveled the far distance to Sinai because Yitro was still a priest of Midian. So Al-Sheikh is saying, look, if we go back to our verse, let me point this out using technology if I can, it says that he was shepherding the flock of Yitro, his father-in-law, and then it gives us this seemingly extraneous reminder that Yitro is a priest of Midian. that doesn't seem to be very relevant to the task at hand. Letting us know that it's not his own flock, that it belongs to his father-in-law. Okay, fine, that's kind of helpful. It's a little reminiscent of Jacob in the house of Lavan, although obviously Yitro is a much better father-in-law. But, we can sort of say that, but why tell us he's a priest? And then, again, is there any connection between that and the moving out behind the wilderness, right? Going, Achar Hamidbar, why is it this? And thus that we then lead in this building sentence to the mountain of God. Well, says Ashich, yes, it all fits together. Moses was taking care of the flock, but he chose deliberately to go in a direction away from Midian that was a long way, precisely because his father-in-law is going to pray. He wants to do so in a place that is away from the idolatry of Midian and that cannot be confused as being part of the priestly activities of his father-in-law, which at that time were still idolatrous. So he is arguing that Moses has already made a first step towards God by removing himself from the trappings of idolatry in Midian, which is all explained by the construction of this verse. Okay, so in difference to Or HaChaim, here we see Moshe actually being the one to make the first move. It is not God luring Moshe to the mountain. It is Moshe looking for something away from idolatry, and that is what leads him to the place of Horeb. Likewise, Tur HaHaruch gives us both a practical reason as well as some other insights. Why is he going to this place? Well, Ibn Ezra understands this in light of the fact that Midian was a satellite state, subject of Pharaoh's sphere of influence. So back in this time period, Egypt's reach was usually beyond the reach of the modern borders of Egypt. Egypt had the domain, its imperial reign over much of what we would now call the Near East. And as such, if Moses was truly being hunted as a murderer within the Egyptian society, then Midian would not entirely be perfectly safe. Thus, this necessitated that Moses became a shepherd, a vocation that enabled him to operate beyond the reach of Pharaoh and his secret service. So, there would have been spies and other informants, wouldn't have been completely under Pharaoh's control in a bureaucratic sense, but there definitely would have been a lot reporting to Pharaoh. And as such, if Moses was just hanging around the town, eventually his Egyptian origin and perhaps more of his backstory would come out, and then Pharaoh might send agents to collect him or demand his extradition or other things. But if he was a shepherd, if he was outside of the town for most of the time, then that would be greatly reduced, which is why it becomes important later on in the chapter. Once God told him that Pharaoh and the members of his regime whom he had fled had died, he was able to name his son Eliezer by saying that God had saved him from the sword of Pharaoh. He recognizes that he is no longer being hunted because of the regime change. So Ibn Ezra, as Tur HaAruch is summarizing him here, brings together sort of the realpolitik of why Moses was here. Now note, this is much less ennobling, much less hagiographic of Moses. It is not extolling him as though he was a saint from birth. Moses was doing what he needed to do practically in order to stay alive, to keep his family safe, to be able to live. However, by doing so, he is putting himself in a position where he is going to have occasion to see God. So some people think that the only way to see God is to go through the great efforts of distancing yourself from society in order to find that lone mountain. That's the Al-Sheikh's position to a certain degree. And Tur HaAruch is basically saying, no, Moses is out in the middle of nowhere because that's the only place he's safe. And doing that, he still is in a position to find God. Now, there are, of course, different opinions, and let's go ahead and see what Shemot Rabbah gives us as its explanation. This is the great Midrashic collection from the early days. The Holy One does not bestow greatness upon a person until he tests him with a minor matter. Only then does he elevate him to prominence. right? Basically trying to say, you'll see among any of the greats that there was always something that looked trivial or accidental, but really that was partly the test, and that test opened up the doorway for the next levels. For example, there were two preeminently great ones, whom the Holy One, blessed be he, tested with a minor matter, and they were found trustworthy, and he elevated them to prominence. So notice that we are going to look at a particular category of these types of tests, a category of testing their trustworthiness, and that the trustworthiness is found to be a foundation upon which God will build. He tested David with the flocks, and he led them only to the wilderness to distance them from robbery. As Eliab said to David, with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? So again, we see a reminder that there the sheep were taken to the wilderness. This teaches that David observed the Mishnah. One may not raise a sheep or goats in the land of Israel. And we're going to come back to this underlying issue here in just a second, but let's get the Moses component. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, you have been found trustworthy with the flocks. Come and herd my flock, meaning BK, as it is stated, from the suckling ewes he brought him. So specifically when he was with the sheep, that led to his ascension to the throne, at least according to this reading of Psalm 78. For Moses, likewise, it says he led the flock deep into the wilderness. That's our Achar Hamidbar, beyond the wilderness, to remove them from theft. And the Holy One, blessed be he, took him to herd Israel. As it is stated, you led your people like a flock in the hand of Moses and Aaron. Again, emphasizing the shepherdedness, the shepherd-like qualities of Moses as being one of the reasons for his elevation, this time taken from Psalm 77. All right, so what is this midrash based upon? Well, it's based upon this Mishnah that's mentioned here in the middle, one that you can find much more discussion about in Bava Kama 79b, which says we don't tend to sheep and goats in the land of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be anywhere. There's lots of different elements to this. But the underlying issue here of why this is the starting position is that, well, sheep and goats eat the land kind of down to the bone, at least if they are kept in large quantities and shepherded around to pastures usually that don't belong to the person who owns the sheep. As was famously said by the man that introduced advanced animal husbandry to mutate sheep into their current version, sheep are a machine for turning grass into mutton. Sheep need to eat. That's what makes sheep live, and it's what makes the meat on the sheep, or in other ways, it makes their milk and their wool. Well, that grass has to come from somewhere. Now, that's not a problem if you're grazing them on your own property. If you want to have the sheep eat your backyard, go right ahead. Nothing wrong with that. But most people will eventually have flocks, if they're successful, that will far outstrip the available grass or other plants in their own property. And that means you'll then take them elsewhere. Well, you've got two choices of where to take them. You can do the right thing and take them out to the wilderness, which is characterized by being ownerless. That's the whole point of being outside of human habitation. Nobody can claim the grass and vegetation in the middle of nowhere because it doesn't belong to anyone. And thus, by shepherding them there, they are getting fed and they are not taking away from anyone else's property by eating someone else's grass. However, by definition, that's inconvenient. Really, the easiest thing to do is to take your sheep and to go to someone else's property and, find some else's upper pastures and fields, put your sheep there and keep an eye out for them, and then just remove them before the owner of the field finds out. And in that way, you'll be saving yourself a great deal of time. And you'll be getting your sheep nice and fat, and you don't have to wander into the wilderness, which is not only distant, but often dangerous. Which is why the Mishnah starts off with the idea that raising these types of animals is a prohibited activity as a general principle, lots of other caveats, as you can imagine, because most people who raise them through theft, that they are fed by stealing the food from someone else's property. But what do we see explicitly about David and what do we see explicitly about Moses? that they shepherded their animals in the wilderness, that they were very careful not to raise them in the settled portions of the land of Israel, that they were, or in Midian for that matter, but they were very careful to take them away. Indeed, Moses going even beyond the edges of the wilderness into truly remote and ownerless space. That, says the Midrash, is a sign of their trustworthiness. You want somebody who's going to become, when someone is going to become king or become Moses, even greater than king, you want that to be a person who has an intrinsic understanding of right and wrong, of what is theft and what is not, what is fair, what is just, what is right. And that is what is seen by this small matter. Again, we may not think of it as being all that important. Indeed, day to day, a lot of people will act as though these small matters, in this case of theft, don't really matter so much. It's not like I'm robbing a bank, but these are the small things which show the greatness of a person's character. And by acting correctly in these small things, both Moses and David are showing that they can be trusted with the big things. After all, if I can't trust you to just feed my sheep properly without stealing from someone, how can I trust you to be in charge of the army and perhaps, lose the lives of thousands of people, or be in charge of the treasury, and when the taxes come in, to use them for the benefit of the people rather than your own comfort and glory? If I can't trust you with things that are small, how can I trust you with something that is great? And both David and Moses are, of course, ultimately trusted with something exceedingly great, the nation. All right, any questions on that before we get to a more mystical, theological, I hate to use the word spiritual because I don't like that dichotomy. All that we study is spiritual, whether it be about the laws of right and wrong, or whether it be about the laws of the different levels of a soul's experience of God. Because indeed, that's how we weave it together. And experiencing God and not changing your behavior is worthless. And changing your behavior without letting yourself see how it can lead you towards God is simply short-sighted. It's still good, but it's still short-sighted. All right, let me just check the live stream. Where'd my mouse go? Okay, now I've lost. There we are. I hate when I lose my cursor like that. Okay, think we're okay there. So let's roll us down here to Benu Bachia. Moshe achieved 3 levels: fire, angel, and divine presence. Now, achieving 3 levels here, I know it's the shorthand speaking of many of our sages. Sometimes I wish they would write longer sentences, and indeed modern writers tend to, precisely for this reason. But books were expensive. It was hard to copy them if they were very long. Lots of editing was done. I know that firsthand, as I try to edit sometimes to make all of my sources fit on 2 sheets, meaning they could be printed front and back. Well, fire, angel, and divine presence here, what we mean is not that he became fire, not that he became an angel, and certainly not that he became the divine presence of the Shekhinah. It's what level of encounter with God did he experience? And he experiences an encounter of God in 3 different ways, each greater than the last. First, he saw the fire. And what this means is he saw the fire. He saw this with his actual physical eye while he was awake. When he saw the bush burning, he thought it was a fire of pitch from beneath. This part of the world, there are many, used to be more, surface level deposits of pitch or of other types of petroleum products, and sometimes they could catch fire and keep burning. Of course, it's kind of weird if it would keep burning and the bush wouldn't be consumed. Thinking that there was just this kind of unusual but still natural fire, and seeing that the bush was not being consumed, which seems odd, he chose to come closer, as it says, "I will turn now and see this wondrous sight." Meaning, I will see this wonderment if the bush is different than normal wood, or the fire is different from other fires. If he had realized it was a heavenly fire, he would not have approached. All right, that's the kicker here. He's trying to show you the different levels of his spiritual progress. He is starting off noticing something with curiosity from God's natural world. At least that's what he thinks he is exploring. And because of that, he is looking at the world a little differently. He is seeing it with wonder. He is seeing it with this curiosity, this amazement, and that is the first flowering of a spiritual life, is to be able to look at the world around you, not just the natural beauty, but sometimes natural oddities, or to look at just life in general, the people around us, our own human construction, whatever it might be, and just say, huh, wow, that's special, that's interesting, that awakens in me a curiosity and a sense of wonder that wasn't there before. And I'll tell you, there are many people who have trouble allowing themselves to have those experiences. It's buried under much emotional muck, but that is that first step. Now, notice he's not approaching this thinking that this is divine. In fact, Rabbeinu Bachya argues that had Moses thought this was a divine act, had he realized that this was divine, then at the emotional and spiritual stage that he was at that moment, when he was the shepherd of Yitro, he probably would have turned around and run away. That he was not prepared to draw closer to God yet, but he was prepared to draw closer to something that was wonderful in God's world. And that step is critical. So, onward, once he saw this fire, meaning once he did draw close, he became stronger through seeing the angel. As it says, he saw an angel of God in the flame within the bush. Again, I will remind you from our text right back here in verse 1, verse 2, that it puts in this unusual phrasing that he saw this Malach Adonai, this angel of God, this messenger of God, and it was seen by him as the flame of a fire out of the midst of the bush. That clunky construction, says our commentator, is there to understand the growth that Moses experiences. He came to see the fire, but in the act of being amazed at the fire, he came to recognize the messenger of God, the malach, the angel, not a great English word, I know. And in that act, that allowed him to experience a level of spiritual enlightenment, awakening, that was greater than just the wonder at seeing the fire in the first place. So by turning aside, he was able to expose himself to a situation that, on further reflection, allowed him to recognize the divine imprint that was inside this act, that it was more than just a natural phenomenon, but that there indeed was a divine element. And now he was ready for that. Because of the step that he had gone through, he was ready for that experience. Once he became stronger than through seeing the angel, then he saw the divine presence, the Shekhinah, in a prophetic vision. This is the meaning of God saw that he turned to see, and he called to him. Because this was the beginning of Moshe's prophecy, God wanted to orient him little by little and lift him up from one level to the next until his mind would be strong enough. This can be compared to someone who is sitting in the dark of a house for a long time. If he exits suddenly and looks at the sun, his vision will be darkened. Therefore, he must look at the light slowly until he becomes accustomed to it. The same way it works with physical light is how it works with the enlightenment of the mind. All mind-related things work similarly to physical things. The traits of the soul are related to the traits of the body. So what Rabbeinu Bachya is trying to draw our attention to here is that this slow escalation of Moses's encounter to God is not just the accidental structure of a story, but this is actually trying to teach us that this is the only way to draw closer to God. We don't go from zero to Shekhinah in 1 second. It takes different layers of exposure to properly strengthen ourselves, let our vision, spiritual vision in this case, be accustomed to be able to actually see. In fact, if we were to go too far too fast, quite the opposite would happen, which is then going to be explained in our next paragraph. We find the same thing with the Israelites. When God gave them the Torah, he did it in small steps. First, he gave them some mitzvot at Marah, namely Shabbat and civil laws. And then he taught the 10 Commandments at Sinai. And the rest was taught at Moab, when Moses was leading us to the edge of the land of Israel, preparing us for crossing over the border without him. When it comes to comprehending God, a person must first expose his mind a little at a time, and in that way his comprehension will continue to expand, like the light of dawn, which starts to shine a little and then expands. Right? Dawn is not a light switch. Anybody who's ever been around when dawn happens will tell you that there is this small light that begins to illuminate the far eastern sky, and little by little it begins to cause the light to grow, the darkness to flee, and eventually the whole sky is alight. That gradual revealing of the world is a metaphor for the gradual revealing of God to the soul. This is what is meant by the verse of the prophet Hosea. We will know, we will chase after knowledge of God and find him like the dawn. This verse teaches that there are people who do not know how to chase and rather try to accomplish everything in one moment. In response to such a person, the verse says, you must know how to chase, which is like the dawn, meaning a little at a time. So often I encounter people who are excited, passionate, desirous of experiencing all that Judaism has to teach them about God and that relationship. And oftentimes they want it all right now, all at once. Come on, give it to me. I can take it. And the fact is that that's simply not the way the human mind works. It's not the way the human soul works. That just like anybody who will ever experience God, the only way to do it well and healthily, both psychologically, emotionally, as well as spiritually, is to do it a little at a time, to allow yourself to expand, to absorb a new lesson, a new way of living with God, one of the mitzvot, or one of the other practices of Judaism. Allow that to become part of life. Allow that to change your view and get you accustomed to that level of looking at God and the world, and then increase a little more, and then a little more, and then a little more. It doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't even happen necessarily in a year. It can happen over the course of many decades for most of us. And that's as it should be. It would be a great deal of arrogance to imagine that just by wishing it, we can experience God to the highest degree, like we would just be opening a door, that somehow we're ready just because we want to be ready. I know there are many other religious traditions out there that do treat and preach that kind of attitude, that all you have to do is open your heart and God will fill your soul. And while it is certainly true that opening your heart and experiencing God through study and mitzvot and Jewish practice will allow you to feel connected, that's not the end. That's just the beginning. And even those mitzvot, which we have already been doing for years, can still be deepened and still be understood at another level, which will take us to another level, which will take us to another level and beyond and beyond. It's not a one and done kind of activity. It really does require a great deal of patience and a great deal of reflection and a great deal of effort. And usually when people are trying to advocate for anything that is fast, quick, and easy, usually there's a large price tag hidden somewhere in that sales pitch that they're expecting you to pick up. And usually it does not have a positive, enduring effect on a life. So, just like Moses, we take our steps. We notice with wonder the world around us. We come to recognize the fingerprints of the divine in the aspects of life around us, and we come to reflect through those experiences more deeply on what God is, until we can feel that experience of God more acutely and more regularly. There is no strict timeline for that other than slowly. And as such, that is my advice to all of us as we continue through our studies of Torah, is to read as fast as you want, but recognize there is a inherent limit to how fast we can absorb the enlightenment that God is trying to give us. Give yourself that room, that space, that patience to experience this as it comes, little by little, and you will have a much better time sitting in the Son of God. That is Son with a U, by the way. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining me for our first study of this Gregorian New Year, and I will see you next week as we continue.